Number 10. The Minoans. Long before classical Greece rose to dominate the imagination of the ancient Mediterranean, the island of Crete was home to one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the Bronze Age. The Minoans built sprawling palace complexes, created vivid frescoes filled with movement and symbolism, developed extensive maritime trade networks, and left behind a culture that seemed unusually refined, fluid, and confident in its place within the wider ancient world. Their art feels alive, their architecture feels ceremonial and complex, and their presence in the region was too large to ignore. That is what makes their disappearance so unsettling. The Minoans were not some isolated culture hiding at the edge of history. They were connected, wealthy, organized, and influential. Centers like Knossos reveal a civilization with layered administrative systems, storage capacity, ritual spaces, and a visual identity powerful enough to endure across centuries. Bull imagery, elite ceremony, seaborne exchange, and carefully structured palatial life all suggest a society that had achieved both cultural prestige and regional power. This was not a fragile world waiting to vanish without consequence. And yet, something happened. One of the most discussed possibilities is the volcanic eruption on Thera, associated with Santorini, one of the most catastrophic natural events of the Bronze Age. The eruption and its aftereffects may have damaged trade, destabilized nearby regions, and weakened the foundations of Minoan dominance. But even that does not provide a clean answer. The timeline is complicated, and the civilization did not simply disappear in a single instant. Instead, there seems to have been a period of disruption, adaptation, and eventual decline, followed by increasing Mycenaean influence from mainland Greece. That only deepens the mystery. If the eruption was not the whole story, then what completed the collapse? Was it environmental trauma followed by political weakening? Was it invasion layered onto earlier instability? Was the civilization transformed from within before outside powers absorbed what remained? The ruins do not speak with one voice. They offer evidence of brilliance, evidence of disruption, and then a long fading of distinct Minoan power into something less clear. What remains is one of history's most haunting patterns, a civilization so vivid in what it left behind, yet so incomplete in its ending. The Minoans did not vanish without trace. They vanished while leaving just enough behind to show how much has been lost. Their frescoes, symbols, and palace ruins still suggest a world of ritual, power, and maritime confidence. But the final chapter remains blurred, suspended somewhere between catastrophe and takeover. And that is why the Minoans belong on this list, because they remind us that civilizations do not always end with a single obvious cause. Sometimes they erode under pressures we can only partly reconstruct, leaving behind ruins beautiful enough to admire and silence deep enough to disturb us. Number 9. The Nabateans. If a civilization could carve its own legend directly into stone, it would look something like Petra. Hidden among the deserts and mountains of the ancient Near East, the Nabateans built one of the most striking urban landscapes in the ancient world. Their facades rose from rock faces with astonishing precision. Their trade networks crossed hostile terrain. Their ability to survive and prosper in arid environments was not just impressive, but highly strategic. They occupied a crucial position between worlds, profiting from commerce, movement, and control over routes that linked Arabia, the Mediterranean, and beyond. That is what makes their fading from power so fascinating. The Nabateans were not simply desert dwellers leaving behind isolated monuments. They were commercially intelligent, culturally adaptive, and politically capable. Petra itself was not just beautiful, it was functional, organized, and tied to a broader system of wealth and regional influence. Water management, trade coordination, architecture, and symbolic display all point to a civilization that understood how to turn harsh geography into advantage. They built prestige in a place most outsiders would have seen as inhospitable. But over time, their dominance began to weaken. Part of the explanation seems to lie in the changing nature of trade. Civilizations built around controlling routes are vulnerable when those routes shift. As maritime trade patterns evolved and imperial powers expanded their reach, the economic foundations that had once made the Nabateans so successful may have grown less secure. Roman annexation further altered the political landscape, absorbing what had once been an independent and highly distinctive power into a much larger imperial system. And yet that is still not the full answer. Because the deeper mystery is not simply why a trade kingdom lost influence. It is why a civilization so closely associated with one of the most unforgettable cities in history seems to dissolve into the background so thoroughly. Petra endures as a visual shock, but the Nabateans themselves often feel strangely distant, as though the stone remained while the people slipped away. Their inscriptions, architecture, and engineering tell us they were real, capable, and highly developed. But their larger cultural identity and final transformation remain less clear than the grandeur of their ruins suggests. That gap between monumental visibility and historical silence is what makes them so compelling. The Nabateans did not leave behind almost no answers in the literal sense. They left behind enough to prove their brilliance, but they also left behind major unanswered questions about how a civilization so skilled at mastering landscape, trade, and symbolic power gradually lost its distinct place in the historical foreground. And that is why Petra feels almost haunted, not because it is empty, but because it preserves the shell of a world whose disappearance still feels larger than the explanations we currently have. Number 8. The Olmecs. Long before the Aztecs and long before the Maya reached the height of their influence, another civilization had already helped shape the cultural foundations of ancient Mesoamerica. Today, we call them the Olmecs. They are often described as a kind of mother civilization, not because every later society came directly from them, but because their influence appears so early, so powerfully, and in ways that echo through later religious symbols, ceremonial traditions, and artistic forms across the region. And yet, for all their importance, the Olmecs remain strangely elusive. They left behind some of the most unforgettable monuments in the ancient Americas, colossal stone heads, immense and human, carved with an authority that still feels almost unsettling. They built ceremonial centers, shaped landscapes, worked stone on a remarkable scale, and developed imagery so distinctive that it still provokes debate. Their art suggests rulership, ritual transformation, and sacred power. Their presence was not minor. This was a civilization with enough organization, labor capacity, and symbolic force to alter the trajectory of an entire region. That is what makes their decline so difficult to explain cleanly. Major Olmec centers such as San Lorenzo and La Venta rose, flourished, and then faded. But why? That is where certainty begins to unravel. Some possibilities point toward environmental change, perhaps shifts in river systems or ecological stress that undermined the stability of their centers. Others suggest internal political disruption, conflict, or changing patterns of regional power. There may have been no single dramatic ending, but rather a complex weakening of the structures that had once made Olmec civilization dominant. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes them belong on this list. The Olmecs did not simply vanish in the most literal sense. Their influence may have flowed into later societies, their ideas surviving even after their core centers lost prominence. But that only sharpens the mystery. If their cultural legacy continued, why did the civilization itself become so difficult to see clearly? Why do they feel at once foundational and obscured, enormously important and yet still half hidden behind the civilizations that came after them? That tension gives the Olmecs a uniquely haunting place in history. They are not a lost world, in the simple sense of a city swallowed by jungle or a kingdom erased overnight. They are something subtler, a civilization whose fingerprints remain everywhere, even as its own final shape slips away from us. Their monuments endure, their symbolic world lingers. But the process by which their great centers declined and their identity dissolved into the wider current of Mesoamerican history remains only partly understood. And that may be the most unsettling kind of disappearance. Not total erasure, but absorption so deep that the civilization still influences history while refusing to fully explain itself. Number 7. The Hittites. There was a time when the Hittites stood among the great powers of the ancient Near East, strong enough to rival Egypt, shape diplomacy, wage major wars, and command a vast political sphere from the heart of Anatolia. They were not a forgotten tribe at the margins of history. They were a true Bronze Age superpower, one of the major forces in a world of kings, empires, and shifting alliances. That is what makes their collapse so extraordinary. The Hittites built a kingdom and later an empire with administrative depth, military strength, and diplomatic sophistication. Their archives preserve treaties, correspondence, and legal traditions that reveal a civilization deeply engaged with the wider ancient world. They were connected to major historical events, including conflicts and negotiations with Egypt, so significant that echoes of them still survive in written record. This was a structured state, not a fragile regional experiment. And yet by the end of the Bronze Age, that structure unraveled. The broader collapse of the late Bronze Age remains one of the most debated upheavals in ancient history. Across multiple regions, palace systems fell, trade networks fractured, cities were destroyed, and long-standing powers either weakened drastically or vanished from the political map. The Hittites were caught inside that storm. Their imperial center fell, their authority broke apart, and one of the most powerful states of its time ceased to exist in the form that had once dominated the region. But explaining that collapse in simple terms has proven nearly impossible. Was it invasion, internal rebellion, climate stress, famine, economic breakdown? The disruptions of migrating groups sometimes associated with the so-called Sea Peoples? Or was it the fatal interaction of multiple pressures at once, creating a chain reaction too severe for even a great empire to survive? That is the deeper mystery. The Hittites did not just disappear from history entirely. Successor states and cultural continuities remained in some form, but the imperial order itself collapsed so completely that for long periods, their former power seemed almost swallowed by silence. That silence is part of what makes them so compelling. For centuries, the Hittites seemed almost ghost-like in the historical record, known only in fragments and external mentions until archaeology began to restore the scale of what had once existed. In a strange way, they vanished twice, first as a civilization losing its central power, and later as a historical memory that had to be rediscovered. And that double disappearance is what earns them this place. The Hittites remind us that even great empires can fall into obscurity so thoroughly that later ages barely remember how powerful they once were. Their ruins, records, and broken capitals tell us that they were real. Their former reach tells us that they mattered. But the exact combination of forces that brought their world down still resists any single final answer. Number 6. The Indus Valley Civilization. Long before many of the ancient world's best-known empires reached their height, the Indus Valley Civilization had already built one of the most remarkable urban systems on Earth. Its cities were carefully planned, its streets laid out with striking order, its drainage systems were unusually advanced, and its settlements suggest a level of organization that still feels astonishing for such an early period. Places like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa do not look like the remains of a primitive society struggling toward complexity. They look like the remains of a civilization that had already solved problems many others would take centuries to address, and that is exactly what makes its decline so haunting. The Indus Valley Civilization was not small, isolated, or culturally insignificant. It stretched across a vast region, supported dense settlement, engaged in trade, and maintained forms of standardization that imply coordination on a very large scale. We find carefully made weights, urban planning, craft production, and a visual system of symbols or script that still has not been conclusively deciphered. That unreadable script is part of the mystery. It means the civilization left behind signs of its voice without giving us a clear way to hear it. And then, slowly, the great urban order seems to fade. What happened remains one of the great unresolved questions of ancient history. Older explanations often leaned toward invasion, but that view no longer satisfies most serious interpretations on its own. Instead, scholars have considered shifting river systems, climate change, weakening agricultural foundations, environmental stress, changing trade patterns, or gradual decentralization that pulled people away from the great cities. But even taken together, these possibilities still do not produce a clean ending. There is no single dramatic answer waiting at the bottom of the ruins. That ambiguity is what makes the Indus Valley civilization feel so unsettling. It did not vanish in a blaze of unmistakable conquest. It seems, at least in part, to have dissolved through transformation, disruption, and retreat from its great urban centers. The people did not simply disappear from the subcontinent, but the civilization as a recognizable urban order, with its major cities and coherent system, lost its shape in ways that remain frustratingly incomplete to us. And the silence deepens because one of the most important keys is still locked. If the script were fully deciphered, perhaps its records would reveal political tensions, economic shifts, religious structure, or the signs of a world under pressure. But without that voice, we are left reading streets, bricks, water channels, and abandoned layouts, trying to reconstruct an ending from architecture alone. That is why the Indus Valley civilization belongs so high on this list. It represents a world that was clearly sophisticated, clearly organized, and clearly real, yet whose final unraveling still escapes precise explanation. Its cities remain as evidence of intelligence and order. Its script remains as evidence of meaning. But between the two lies one of the largest historical silences anywhere in the ancient world. Number 5. The Moche. Along the northern coast of ancient Peru, the Moche built a world of striking power, visual intensity, and ritual complexity. They were master craftspeople, engineers, and image makers, producing ceramics and metalwork so vivid that they still feel almost disturbingly alive. Their art does not merely decorate the past, it seems to stare back at it, showing warriors, prisoners, priests, sacrifice, animals, gods, and scenes that hint at a world where power and ritual were tightly bound together. That is what makes their decline so fascinating. The Moche were not a single fragile settlement that vanished without trace. They occupied a difficult environment and built systems capable of sustaining life in it. Through irrigation and control of resources, they created centers of authority and ceremonial architecture on a scale that reveals real political and social power. They adapted to a landscape where the balance between survival and disaster was always precarious, and for a long time, they made that balance work. But the same environment that made their achievements impressive may also help explain why their world became unstable. One of the leading possibilities is that severe climate disruptions, especially major El Niño events, may have played a devastating role. Flooding, drought, agricultural stress, and ecological instability could have placed enormous strain on a system already dependent on careful management of water and land. A civilization can appear strong for generations, but if its environmental foundations are pushed too far, even impressive ritual and political structures may begin to fracture. Still, climate alone may not explain everything. There are also signs that internal conflict, political fragmentation, and shifting centers of power may have contributed to the Moche decline. That is what makes the mystery deeper. Their collapse may not have been the result of one disaster, but of multiple pressures converging at once: environmental shocks, weakened authority, social tension, and the erosion of the systems that held the civilization together. And yet the Moche did not simply vanish into total invisibility. Their cultural traces remained powerful, and later societies in the region emerged in landscapes they had once shaped. But the distinctive Moche world, with its particular artistic voice, ceremonial order, and regional dominance, lost coherence. Its centers weakened, its identity fractured, its history became harder to follow in a straight line. That sense of fragmentation is part of what makes them so compelling. The Moche left behind images full of meaning, but not full clarity. Their art tells us they were sophisticated. Their monuments tell us they were organized. Their irrigation works tell us they were capable of mastering harsh terrain. But the final collapse of that world remains partly obscured, as though we can still see the face of the civilization without being allowed to witness its last moment clearly. And that may be the most unsettling thing about the Moche. They left behind one of the most vivid visual records of any ancient culture, yet their ending remains blurred enough to remind us that even a civilization that shows us so much can still keep its final answers hidden. Number 4. The Mycenaeans. Before the classical world of Athens and Sparta, before philosophy, democracy, and the age most people picture when they think of ancient Greece, there was another civilization of palaces, fortresses, warrior elites, and royal centers spread across the mainland. Today we call them the Mycenaeans. They built heavily defended citadels, maintained complex palace economies, used writing for administration, and formed one of the dominant powers of the late Bronze Age Aegean. And then their world broke apart. That is what makes the Mycenaeans so haunting. They were not a minor culture fading at the edge of history. They were deeply embedded in a larger international system of trade, politics, warfare, and elite exchange. Their centers, including places like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, reveal a civilization capable of organization on a substantial scale. Their architecture projects power, their burials project wealth. Their records, preserved in Linear B, show a world governed through administration, storage, hierarchy, and carefully managed resources. This was a civilization that looked stable. But by the end of the Bronze Age, that stability gave way to collapse. Palace centers were destroyed or abandoned. Administrative systems disappeared. Writing itself fell out of use in mainland Greece for a time. The wider world that had once connected the Mycenaeans to other great powers was fragmenting, and what followed is often described as a kind of dark age. That phrase can oversimplify things, but it captures the shock of the transition. A highly organized civilization did not merely decline, it lost the very structures that had defined it. And the reasons remain debated. Some explanations point toward invasion or outside attack. Others suggest internal conflict, social unrest, environmental stress, economic breakdown, or the failure of a palace system too centralized to survive wider disruption. There may also have been earthquakes, regional warfare, or cascading crises connected to the broader late Bronze Age collapse. But no single answer neatly resolves the puzzle. Like other civilizations on this list, the Mycenaeans seem to have been overtaken by a convergence of pressures rather than one clean ending. That is where the mystery deepens. Because the Mycenaeans did not vanish from cultural memory entirely. In fact, they may survive indirectly through legend. Some of the world remembered in later Greek epic, fortified kings, heroic warfare, rich palace centers, and long echoes of a conflict like Troy, may preserve fragments of the Mycenaean age, transformed into story after the civilization itself had already fallen. If that is true, then the Mycenaeans represent one of the clearest examples of a real historical world collapsing so thoroughly that it had to survive inside myth. And that is why they belong here. Their ruins show us grandeur. Their records show us structure. Their disappearance shows us fragility. The Mycenaeans were powerful enough to help shape the memory of ancient Greece, yet vulnerable enough to lose the world that made that memory possible. What remains is a civilization still visible in stone, still audible in fragments, and still not fully explained in the way it ended. Number 3. The ancestral Puebloans. Across the dry landscapes of the American Southwest, the remains of the ancestral Puebloans still carry an almost eerie sense of intelligence, adaptation, and purpose. Cliff dwellings tucked into canyon walls, carefully built masonry communities, ceremonial spaces, road networks, and large settlement centers all point to a society that understood both its environment and the spiritual meaning of place at a very deep level. These were not accidental shelters or simple villages. They were parts of a world deliberately shaped over time by people who knew how to survive in harsh terrain and give that survival cultural form. That is what makes their dispersal so mysterious. The ancestral Puebloans created some of the most visually striking settlement patterns in North American history. Places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon still feel astonishing in their placement and design. The architecture suggests planning, labor coordination, and social organization. The ceremonial structures suggest a world ordered not only by practical need, but by shared systems of meaning. This was a civilization rooted in landscape but not dominated by it. For long stretches of time, they made difficult conditions livable and symbolically powerful. And then, in many key areas, they left. That departure is one of the most debated and emotionally charged patterns in the archaeology of the region. There is no mystery in the simple sense that the people vanished from existence. Descendant communities remain, and the continuity of culture matters deeply. But the question is why major centers were abandoned, why settlement patterns shifted so dramatically, and why places that once held such importance were no longer occupied in the same way. Several explanations have been proposed and many likely overlap. Prolonged drought is often seen as a major factor, especially in a region where water and agriculture were always precarious. Resource pressure, deforestation, social stress, internal conflict, and changing religious or political priorities may also have contributed. As conditions changed, staying in the old centers may have become less viable, less sustainable, or less meaningful than moving elsewhere. But even with these explanations, the process still resists any one simple narrative, and that is part of what gives these sites their haunting quality. The structures remain, but the life that once filled them is absent. The architecture seems too intentional to be random, too meaningful to be dismissed as mere survival, and too silent to explain itself fully. When people look at the cliff dwellings and great houses today, they often ask the wrong question: why did they disappear? The deeper question may be, why did a world so carefully built decide or need to move on? That distinction matters. The ancestral Puebloans did not vanish into oblivion, but some of their greatest centers were left behind, and the reasons behind that transformation still involve uncertainty, complexity, and difficult historical reconstruction. Their story is not one of total disappearance, but of withdrawal from places that still look powerful enough to hold memory long after the people changed course. And that is why they belong near the top of this list, because their ruins do not just represent a lost civilization. They represent a civilization whose relationship to place, survival, and change was profound enough that when parts of that world were abandoned, the silence left behind became one of the most powerful mysteries in North American history. Number 2, the Maya collapse. Few phrases in ancient history are as dramatic or as misleading as the Maya collapse, because the Maya did not simply disappear. Their descendants survived, their culture endured, their languages remain alive. And yet there is still something profoundly mysterious about what happened to many of the great classic Maya cities, especially in the southern lowlands, where once powerful urban centers were gradually abandoned, monuments ceased to be raised, dynasties broke apart, and a world of kingship, ritual, and monumental architecture lost its old shape. That is what makes the Maya such a perfect number 2. At their height, the Maya built one of the most intellectually and artistically remarkable civilizations in the ancient world. They developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, calendrical systems, dynastic history, monumental architecture, and complex political networks spread across a challenging landscape. Their cities were not random clusters of buildings. They were ceremonial, political, and symbolic worlds, each one tied to rulership, cosmic order, warfare, and legitimacy. This was a civilization capable of extraordinary sophistication. And then many of its greatest centers began to fail. The reasons remain intensely debated, and that is exactly why the Maya collapse continues to haunt historians and archaeologists. Drought is one of the most discussed factors, especially given how vulnerable complex societies can become when water systems fail or rainfall patterns shift over long periods. But drought alone is unlikely to explain everything. There is also evidence of warfare, dynastic instability, overpopulation, environmental stress, resource exhaustion, and the breakdown of political systems that may have become too competitive or too fragile to endure mounting pressure. That convergence is what makes the collapse so difficult to reduce to one cause. It was not simply a city falling to invasion, nor a kingdom vanishing overnight. It appears more like the unraveling of a system from within and without, at the same time. Kings kept building monuments even as the world around them may have been becoming less sustainable. Rivalries deepened. Stress accumulated. The sacred and political structures that held power together may have begun to fail just when people needed them most. And yet even that does not fully explain the emotional force of the Maya collapse. Because what remains feels so complete in one sense, and so broken in another. We still have the temples, we still have the carved stelae, we still have the glyphs, the dynasties, the records of rulers and wars, the civilization left behind enough to prove its brilliance beyond doubt. But when we reach the question of why many of these great centers were abandoned, certainty dissolves into overlapping probabilities. That is why the Maya belong so high on this list. They show how a civilization can leave behind vast intellectual achievement and still deny us a simple explanation for its transformation. Their cities did not vanish because the Maya were somehow lost to history. Their cities vanished because even advanced, literate, and deeply ceremonial worlds can fracture in ways that are gradual, uneven, and only partly visible in the ruins. And that may be the most disturbing lesson of all. The Maya collapse reminds us that a civilization does not have to disappear completely in order for one of its greatest worlds to come to an end. Number 1. The people of Sangsingdui. If history sometimes hides its greatest mysteries in plain sight, then Sangsingdui may be one of the most unsettling examples ever discovered. When archaeologists began uncovering the site in China's Sichuan region, what emerged did not fit neatly into the familiar picture many people had of early Chinese civilization. Instead of artifacts that felt comfortably expected, the earth gave up enormous bronze masks with exaggerated eyes, strange faces that seemed almost otherworldly, monumental figures, ritual objects of extraordinary craftsmanship, and a symbolic world so visually distinct that it seemed to challenge assumptions about what ancient China was supposed to look like. That alone would have been enough to make Sangsingdui remarkable. But the deeper mystery is not just what the site contained. It is what kind of civilization created it, how such a sophisticated cultural center developed with such a unique visual identity, and why it seems to vanish from the historical foreground in a way that still leaves so many questions behind. This was not the work of a marginal society. The scale of the bronzes, the complexity of the ritual deposits, and the clear signs of organized production all point toward a highly developed culture with power, symbolism, and technical ability of an astonishing order. And yet for centuries, that world was absent from the standard story. That is what gives Sangsingdui its extraordinary force. It feels like the rediscovery of a civilization that should have been impossible to overlook, and yet somehow was. The people behind the site were not minor participants in early history. They created works so distinctive that even now they seem to belong to a separate sacred imagination, one with its own understanding of divinity, authority, ritual, and representation. The masks alone suggest a symbolic language that was powerful, deliberate, and still not fully understood. So what happened to them? Some scholars suggest that environmental change, especially shifts in river systems, may have disrupted the settlement patterns and political foundations of the culture. Others point toward cultural transformation, migration, absorption into other regional traditions, or a relocation of political and ritual centers rather than a simple extinction. That may be true, but even if the people did not vanish in a literal sense, the distinct civilization visible at Sangsingdui seems to slip away in a way that still feels abrupt and unresolved, and that is precisely why it deserves the #1 spot. Because Sangsingdui does not only represent a civilization that vanished, it represents a civilization whose rediscovery changes the map of what we think the ancient world was. Its existence reminds us that entire centers of brilliance can remain hidden, not only in the ground but in the gaps of historical memory itself. It shows how incomplete our inherited narratives can be, and how much of humanity's past may still lie outside the stories we have learned to treat as complete. The people of Sangsingdui left behind faces in bronze that still feel like they are staring through time at us, daring us to admit how little we truly know. Their art tells us they were powerful. Their ritual objects tell us they believed in something immense. Their disappearance tells us that even civilizations capable of astonishing achievement can pass out of view so thoroughly that when they return, they do not just answer old questions. They create entirely new ones. And that is why Sangsingdui is #1. Because it is not merely the mystery of a lost civilization. It is the mystery of a civilization so extraordinary that its reappearance forces history itself to look incomplete.